Welcome to this video about World Quantitative Easing or QE in 7 minutes. I am Gregoire Dupont and I have 20 years experience of portfolio management as a hedge fund manager and prop trader. In a previous video called Quantitative Easing in 7 minutes, we looked at the definition of QE. Quantitative easing or QE is considered as unconventional monetary policy where the central bank wants to stimulate the economy by buying long-term securities, i.e. bonds, in the open market to increase money supply. Recently, over the month of March 2020, different central banks announced new QE measures. That started with the ECB, which announced a 750 billion Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, PEPP, in order to combat the coronavirus. Similarly, on the 18th of March 2020, the Bank of England announced a new QE of 200 billion sterling. At the bottom here, we have the Fed, which started first with QE4, which was roughly 700 billion, but very quickly the Fed realized that it was not enough and announced on the 23rd of March 2020 QE infinity. Similarly, that is not on that slide, but we could had the Sweden that announced 200 billion Swedish krona, or New Zealand that announced 30 billion kiwis, and so forth. So let's look at the Fed balance sheet since the Great Financial Crisis. So QE started in the US in 2008 with QE. Then we had another wave of QE, which was QE2 in 2010, and another one in 2013. In this slide, started in blue with the normalization in 2017, in September 2017, where the Fed tried to reduce its balance sheet. But very quickly, the Fed had to increase its balance sheet from September 2019, first with repo operations, which could, in a sense, not be considered as QE, but still, the size of the Fed balance sheet was going higher. Then, since March 2020, the Fed tried to calm the credit markets by committing first, as I said, 700 billion, but to readjust very quickly to unlimited QE. Through this unlimited QE, 3.5 trillion is expected to grow on the Fed balance sheet, and the Fed balance sheet to end up at 8 trillion at the end of this quantitative easing program. Similarly, the Bank of Japan has been doing active QE since 2012, where now the Fed, the Bank of Japan, the BOJ balance sheet is standing roughly at 6 trillion Japanese yen, or roughly 5 trillion US dollar. The third central bank is the ECB, which has now 5 trillion under its balance sheet and which is growing. So that is why for the last few years, central banks have been pushing for fiscal stimulus. Why? Because quantitative easing has been returning diminishing returns. So if we listen to all the central bankers, they have been calling for the last few years for fiscal stimulus. So against this crisis of the coronavirus, we have now fiscal stimulus and monetary QE. So those two tools together are used to work against the coronavirus. So here I'm using these charts from yardeni.com just to give you roughly the idea of the size of the four big balance sheets of the central banks. So in red we have the Fed, the ECB in blue, the Bank of Japan in green, and the Bank of China in yellow. As you can see, the size is roughly the same, even if it's a bit misleading because it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. That gives you the size of those four players. The only problem that we have here, and we can raise here, is the size of the GDP of those countries are very different. So if we take the US, they make roughly 24% of the world GDP. China is the same more or less as Europe, making 60%. But Japan is only 6%. So as we can see here, the size of the balance sheet versus the GDP is quite different. So if we look at QE4/QE infinity versus the Great Financial Crisis, The QE1, when it started, the size of the balance sheet of the Fed was roughly 2.1 trillion, and we ended up at 2.3 trillion versus a 15 trillion GDP. For the QE4, QE infinity, that started in mid-March, at the end of February 2020, the Fed had roughly at 4.2 trillion balance sheet, whereas now we are already standing at 5.8 trillion, and we should end up at 8 trillion versus a 19 trillion GDP for the US economy. So if we put this into a chart, that tells you about the weekly change of the QE from one week to another. As you can see with the red, green, and blue at the right-hand side of this slide, this is the weekly change from the Fed. So that is something that is completely unheard that we never saw. And that is the size of roughly 600 billion every week over the last 3 weeks. So still, we need to compare the size of the balance sheet versus the GDP. As you can see here in gray, the Japanese balance sheet of the central bank is 100% of the GDP. For the US one, which is in blue, we are still at 25-30%, but way below the 40% of the ECB. So if we were taking the same level as the ECB, we should end up at 40% of roughly 20 trillion, which will give you 8 trillion. So at the end of quantitative easing, the size of the balance sheet of the Fed versus the GDP should be similar to the European one. So again, I think when we look at the size of the balance sheet, we should be looking at the moves weekly, on a weekly basis, but as well be looking at the size of the balance sheet versus the GDP. As always, I hope it helps, and see you soon. Bye-bye.